what does it mean to be civilized, or at least to live in a civilized society? Because that's the question I got from the 1974 vigilante thriller Death Wish starring Charles Bronson. In that movie, Bronson plays Paul Kersey, a mild-mannered architect living in New York City with his wife. He has an adult daughter who herself is also married. But Kersey's life turns upside down when one day a group of thugs decide to follow his wife and daughter back to their apartment from a trip to the grocery store, and during that confrontation, they violently assault the two of them, leaving his wife dead and his daughter in a catatonic state because of all the trauma that she endured during that assault. Kersey does what most people try to do in a civilized society when something like this happens, which is to step aside and let the police handle everything. Meanwhile, he still can't get over the fact that he was helpless to actually do anything about it, so he starts making moves to try to better defend himself so that if something like this were to happen to him, that he could actually take care of himself. During that time, he is forced to defend himself against a mugger who pulls a knife on him, but naturally this freaks out Kersey because he's never been in a situation where he's had to defend himself before against an attacker. So he decides to take his boss up on an offer to go out to Tucson, Arizona for a business trip to work on some type of development deal. And Kersey figures this is a good opportunity for him to kind of get away from the situation and clear his head and focus on something else other than his catatonic daughter who's currently in the hospital being looked after by her husband. And on this business trip, Kersey meets his client Ames, who one evening decides to take Kersey to his gun club. And during conversation with him at the gun club, Ames brings up the idea that Tucson, Arizona has significantly less crime than in New York, and he accredits that to the fact that everyone there has guns and no one wants to mug anyone or do anything to anyone because there's the potential that they can get shot if they try that. It's also revealed during this scene that Kersey is a good shot with the pistol, having been taught by his father who grew up hunting, but Kersey decided never to touch a firearm again after his father was accidentally shot during a hunting accident, which is why Kersey was also a conscientious objector during the Korean War. As time goes on, Ames becomes more impressed with Kersey's job performance, and when it comes time for Kersey to head back to New York, Ames decided to give him a gift and he leaves it in his checked bag. Unbeknownst to Kersey, though, this is actually a gun that he finds out once he's back in New York and decides to open it. It's at this time Kersey also gets back some photos that he had developed of him and his wife on a vacation right before she died, and the emotion of this situation got to him to the point where he decides to get his gun and just go on a walk out in a dangerous neighborhood, not necessarily asking for trouble, but kind of expecting trouble to find him, which it eventually does when a mugger does try to mug him. So he decides to shoot this mugger. Freaked out, obviously, that he actually killed someone for the first time in his life, he runs back to his home where he immediately starts throwing up. Kersey quickly gets over this, though, and he eventually just decides that he's going to use his appearance as kind of a well-off man in dangerous neighborhoods to provoke responses from potential muggers and other criminals, where he then proceeds to shoot them. Of course, with a lot of criminals dying out in the streets and pretty public places, the police eventually get wind that it is a vigilante on the loose killing all these criminals, so they put out a task force to try to find this vigilante, because if word gets out that this vigilante is killing people, they're worried about potential copycats, especially when it's determined that these killings from all these muggers and other criminals are causing a reduction in crime throughout the rest of the city, because a lot of other criminals aren't going to try anything because they don't know if the person they're going after is the potential vigilante that everyone is talking about. Kersey's actions grow increasingly more bold until eventually he himself is shot while trying to confront 3 different guys while surrounded, and he winds up in the hospital. Meanwhile, the police have basically determined that he is the vigilante that is going around killing these people, but the detective on the case decides to make a deal with him because the city likes the idea that criminals are afraid of a potential vigilante out there, so they don't want to necessarily arrest him. Not to mention, arresting him would also create a martyr out of him, so they decide to cut a deal where if he just leaves town, they'll just drop everything. So Kersey eventually decides that that's what he'll do. He'll take a transfer with his job and go to Chicago instead. When Kersey gets to Chicago, one of the first things he notices is a woman being accosted by several guys, so Kersey goes up to try to help her pick up her things, and the last shot of the movie is him looking at the guys with a smile on his face while doing the finger gun towards them, basically indicating that he's not done with his vigilantism yet. One thing I like about this movie is the overall pacing to everything, because at around 90 minutes, it's not a super long film, so you would think they would lack characterization in order to get to the action, but that's not really the case here. And you can see the relationship between Kersey and his wife prior to the incident, the phases of grief that he has immediately after she dies, and then the slowly descend into the world of violence that he basically joined because of the incident with his wife and his daughter. Too often the non-modern movies, they'd basically extend out each one of these phases for Kersey, so it can give you a better idea about what's going on with the character, but it's ultimately unnecessary. It gives you enough in this movie to understand the character just to move on to the next thing. You don't need to stay longer than what you have to in order to tell the story. I also like the ambiguous nature to the messaging of the movie about whether vigilantism is actually the right thing to do in a situation where the police are overwhelmed by the amount of violent crime in the city. I mean, the movie does point out how his methods do reduce violent crime in the city by deterring a lot of other potential criminals, but they also embolden other honest citizens to defend themselves against criminal acts. However, despite Kersey's best efforts, he never does actually kill the people who killed his wife and assaulted his daughter. So despite everything he went through, they really did just kind of get away with it. And the only reason Kersey didn't wind up dead or in jail was basically because of luck. Charles Bronson even said he felt the message of the movie was that violence begets violence. And that's really kind of what happens in this situation. Because if you look at the inciting incident, his wife and daughter weren't necessarily targeted for any particular reason. They were just kind of victims of random acts of violence by some criminals who thought that they looked like that they had money, so that's why they attacked them, and that's really it. And then when Kersey decides to become a vigilante and go after people, he's not necessarily seeking out these guys in particular. He's just going after any random criminal who decides to attack him. So what he's doing is also a random act of violence, but his random act of violence is targeting criminals versus the criminals targeting the innocent. Going back to my initial question about what it means to live in a civilized society, this movie kind of has it both ways, because it says it's not civilized to live in a society where criminals basically run amok to do whatever they want, but at the same time, it's not civilized when you have people just taking their law in their own hands in the manner that Kersey's doing. However, you do have this conversation with him and his son-in-law in the movie, where his son-in-law says it's not civilized to actually defend yourself in a fight.
What do you call people who, when they're faced with a condition of fear, do nothing about it? They just run and hide.
Civilized?
On the other hand, you have someone like Ames in Arizona who argues that it wouldn't be civilized to not be able to defend yourself. Especially when you consider that a lot of the times Kersey isn't really doing anything illegal. I mean, all he's really doing is walking around in bad neighborhoods during late hours, presenting himself as a target for potential muggers, carrying his gun on him in the hopes that if someone does attack him, that he can respond with deadly force. But at the same time, shouldn't people be allowed to walk around the streets whenever they want to? At least in a free society, they should be allowed to. Now, if criminals have reign over those areas, then I want to consider that a very civilized society if criminals get to dictate when people can and cannot go in certain areas of a city. And that's really what I like about this movie. It's very tightly constructed and is asking some important questions that we're still asking 50 years from now. I mean, whether people should be allowed to defend themselves or should they be obligated to run away first? Should we have to rely on the police for all of our defense purposes? Or is that just letting criminals kind of run wild in areas where policing is underrepresented? Couple that together with enjoyable performances and action scenes that are engaging enough but aren't too over the top, then I'd recommend this movie with an 8 out of 10. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Are you kind of on the side that people should be allowed to take the law into their own hands, or do you think Kersey went a little bit too overboard with this? And also make sure you subscribe to this channel if you want to stay up to date on latest and entertainment news. And also I'm going to be putting out more of these retro reviews in the future, so I hope you stick around and enjoy those as well. So thank you for watching this video.